It's like a football game where there's 3 hours of standing around and replays and 15 minutes of actual live gameplay. That's what this song was like. We're listening to a bunch of noise, then 71 words. I counted them twice.
Hello and welcome to another episode of 1001 Album Complaints, a show where longtime friends, musicians, and complainers of the highest order break down a classic album from the list of 1001 albums you must hear before you die. We will give this album a thorough deep dive, give you a sense for how it was made, and then we'll vote on whether it actually belongs on the list or not. Now, you'll notice I've already dropped some variation of the word complain twice already, so this is your very obvious clue that we are going to poke some fun at this album. But rest assured, we are musicians ourselves. We know what it's like to write and record music, so please know that we do this with the utmost appreciation for the craft in mind. My name's Alan. I've played music for the past 25 years or so, and today I'm excited to talk about an album that was once described by its own record executive as being so bad that if they released it, it could kill the band's career.
Jeez. Wow. Wrong again.
Yeah, that guy wishes he never said that. I will just spoil alert on that one. But the record is Yankee Hotel Foxtrot by the band Wilco. Now, to give you a taste of this record, let's play a clip from the opening track. We've got a little taste of what this record is all about, and we're on the same page here. Let's go around the horn and introduce our esteemed panel by way of a brief, mean tweet-length review of this album. And I'm going to start with Rob.
Thanks so much, Alan. Excited to get into it. And listen, I'm not going to bury the lead here. I want to say up front that I love this record, but if I was being particularly uncharitable or, say, putting myself in Adam's shoes, I might say something like this. You, too, can record a hit indie record. Just start banging on your toaster with a broken AM radio, or try plonking away on your toddler's xylophone with the loose change in your pocket. And make sure to punch yourself in the throat a few times before any vocal takes. If done right, you'll be hailed as rock and roll saviors and elevated to dad rock minor league baseball stadium icons.
Oh, wow. Now we're veering into punk rock territory. And also the use of dad rock has happened dangerously too early in this podcast.
I'm a little worried.
Let's kick things over to Adam.
I don't have to do a tweet now. Rob took care of it. No, everybody, this is Adam. And picture this. A newborn baby lying atop a sand sculpture of a snowflake. That snowflake is sitting on a house of cards. That house of cards is anchored to the Death Star. What am I describing? The only thing in the universe more vulnerable than Jeff Tweedy's vocals.
Okay. I don't know what to make of that, but I think we're in for a wild one here for sure.
God forbid somebody express emotion on a recording, Adam.
All right. And we're going to go to a very special guest that we have here this evening. We'll give her a more proper introduction momentarily, but I want to kick things over to our very special guest, Jen Tully. What you got for us, Jen?
Hey guys, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here and to get into it with this album. But, since you rarely have ladies on the show, I felt like I needed to take advantage of my tweet length review time and use it for a PSA. So here we go. My tweet length review in the form of a public service announcement is this. If the Wilco album Yankee Hotel Foxtrot is referenced anywhere in a dude's dating profile, he is only ever going to take you camping or make you watch him rock climb. You're welcome. Those are just facts. I'm just spouting facts.
That's great. It's funny because it's true, Jen, sadly.
It would be a tell. I think it would tell you a lot about a person.
Well, there you go.
Whether you want to know that or not. So that's apt.
Yeah, it was either that or it's Yankee Hotel Foxtrot, the soundtrack to washing your Jeep. Like one of those, right? Has to go.
Yeah. On your way to REI.
Yes, in your Patagonia vest, the whole deal.
As I'm currently scrubbing my closet for any hiking gear. Awesome. Well, this is Alan here, and my mean tweet review, which is not so mean, a band whose name comes from a military term that's short for will comply. Wilco has in many ways lived up to its name by becoming the quintessential dad rock band of our time. But in a brief period of intense rebellion back in 2001, they went AWOL with the wildly experimental Yankee Hotel Foxtrot and may have unknowingly crafted the aughts version of, dare I say, Pet Sounds.
Ooh, all right.
I know we're going to move on from the tweet length reviews and give Jen an introduction and get into the rest of the show, but I just want to give you, the audience, my real tweet length review of what I actually think, because I know we've been trying to make them extra mean lately. If I'm being honest, my real tweet length review, this is Rob, is Yankee Hotel Foxtrot is a brilliantly produced, risk-taking, forward-thinking piece of perfectly heartbreaking Americana.
Wow.
And I'm excited to talk about it with you guys and tell Adam why he's wrong.
That should be the title of this podcast, is telling Adam why he's wrong.
That's a theme here. Why does Adam's musical taste suck so much? .com.
Okay. Now that we have registered our very poignant reflections on this album, I'd like to give a proper introduction to our very special guest, Jen Tully. So we're thrilled to have you with us this week, Jen. Jen's the host of a weekly podcast called What Are You Listening To?, a show where she brings on a guest each week to deep dive on the music that's top of mind for that person that week. It's a show created to foster community through music by sharing the stories of the songs that serve as the soundtrack to our lives. So welcome, Jen.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm such a huge fan of the show. I've had Rob and Tom on my podcast, so I'm really, really happy to be joining you guys on yours.
Very excited to have you as well, Jen. And I'll just say, I want to rep your show too, because yeah, it came on, it was a great time, but I've also listened to a bunch of your other episodes. And I think it's a great premise where you're basically having a guest on, you're getting to know each other through the language of what songs they pick, which is a great way to get to know people. So really, really interesting conversations.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm always excited to jump in and talk to someone about music. And I think as music people, it's a way that we naturally connect, right? It's like our version of sports. So it's easy to do that whenever you're getting to know somebody, but the language you're using is songs.
Absolutely.
That's funny. I've heard Seinfeld talk about how he can only talk and hang out with other comedians. Maybe there's like a little slice of that with musicians too. It's like you only really ever let your guard down around other people who know like what you're doing.
It's true.
Well, back to what you can learn about somebody in a quick segment. I feel like if I were to ask somebody, hey, what music are you listening to this week? And if they were to say nothing or I don't know, I'm not judging, but that would be a tell about what it might be like to have a conversation with this person. So.
Right.
Ironically, if you ask somebody what music they like and they say everything, that's also bad.
Nice to have you, Jen. And I, again, just want to direct our listeners to check out the What Are You Listening To podcast on your streaming platform of choice. Don't judge it too harshly if you do come across one of the ones that has Tom or Rob in it, but I will certainly not blame Jen for that.
They were excellent guests, very well informed, I will say, both.
Very cool. Very cool. Okay, let's get into general impressions. I'm really excited. This has already taken a different turn than I expected. My opinion is definitely a little bit more aligned towards Rob's stated opinion on this, but let's hear some general impressions of this record.
I want to come out first, if you don't mind, Alan, because I have a lot to say here, and so I'm going to pick my moments. I think this record is so interesting and well produced, and I want to kind of just right off the bat refute Jen's "this is the basic bitch" outfit of the modern male. Because I think it's a little unfair, or I think the context needs to be added to it, which is at the time it was a hard left turn. 20 plus years on, it might seem like the most obvious thing to do, or I can craft a whole identity out of liking this record. I'm not suggesting I'm unique for liking the record. I'm simply suggesting that at the time it was weird. And I think that, and we could talk more about this as it goes, but I think this time in music was actually a very fruitful time for outsider music. It was a time when the making of records was getting more democratized very quickly and cheaper very quickly, and record labels were losing power overall in helping to shape the record buying populace's taste, as I'm sure we're going to hear in the story. And then overall, there was just less money at stake, right? And so I think a lot of bands were more incentivized in that time period to take chances and make these strange personal artifacts, some of which have gone on to set the tone for a lot of what came after them, but that's not exactly their fault. So I'm just a big fan of raw outsider art, and I think that when you're framing it from the point of when this was made, that's what this was.
I like raw outsider art too, just not when it's so boring. Well, I love Jeff Tweedy. Like, I'm so torn about this. You know, I know this is like their most critically praised album. Everybody loves this Wilco album. Maybe it's because, here I go, I'm like starting trouble already. I'm kind of a J. Farrar girl. So I like Sunvolt. So I like AM if I'm talking about Wilco albums, right? And this is completely a departure. So I do agree with you. Like, for being innovative, for being different, they win. But sometimes I feel like Jeff Tweedy's lyrics are like just weird to be weird and don't make sense. So some of that was like lost on me. And then again, like, yes, there are 5 tracks that I will listen to over and over, and the rest of the album is for sleepy time.
Wait, are you suggesting that someone who went on to name one of his later albums Schmilko isn't a serious lyricist? Is that what you're suggesting?
He is, though. When he's like really playing serious ball, he's written some of the best lyrics I've ever heard. Box Full of Letters. I mean, wow. I can't find the time to write my mind the way I want it to read. Like, that's genius, right? And I didn't get a lot of that from this album.
First of all, Wilco Schmilko is a great album title that is in reference to Nielsen Schmielsen.
I know.
So there's clear precedent there. Both great songwriters, by the way. And yeah, I think Tweedy as a songwriter is great. I will definitely have some complaints about some of the lyrical chances he takes and completely misses on. They're definitely there. But I think that is part of the package of being someone who's trying things, who's trying to be this impressionistic, put ideas and pictures in your head through words. You're not going to hit a home run every time, and I'm okay with that.
I know I'll shock everyone when I say I had never heard this before this week, and no big surprise there. It grew on me. First time through was rough. My main complaint is Jeff Tweedy's vocals. I feel like he is trying so hard to sound emotional and vulnerable that it swings to completely the opposite side and sounds like it's put on. Like he walked in, he's like, let me just try one more really emotional take. Like he did the Eric Clapton Ocean Boulevard album where he barely opens his mouth just to show you how, he's so tormented as an artist. So that rubbed me wrong a little bit. But I also called this album, it was a musical mood ring, in that it didn't necessarily make me feel a certain way, but it amplified what I happened to be feeling when I listened to it. So there were a couple times where I was in a really good mood and I put this on and I was like, yes, this is Sgt. Pepper of 2002. This is amazing. And then I put it on when I was in a bad mood and I was just angrier at his vocals. So it was a real roller coaster ride of a week for me. But I'm really looking forward to the story because I could honestly be swayed in either direction. I know I came out hot in the tweet, but the more I listen to it, there is a lot of cool stuff on this album.
The story, I will tell you, is it's more about dysfunction, I think, than it's illuminating about or that it will convince you to like it. But there might be something in here for you that you walk away with.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's an underdog story ultimately. And again, we're looking at it in 2024 when Wilco is this one of the last American rock and roll bands who's sort of touring, maybe underground rock and roll bands, let's say, who's having success out there on the touring circuit, who has these super loyal fans. And like I mentioned in my mean tweet, is playing, big theater venues, good venues all across the country. But I do think it's a grower of an album. I think a week's not long enough to really get the vibe of this. And I think this record, as I re-examined it this week, is very much mid-20s heartbreak. Old enough to know better. I thought I was going to marry this person. You're an adult. You're living on your own. And one of the things I felt re-listening to it was it made me feel embarrassed for all the feelings I had back then. Like the sheer depth of my emotions over what seemed like now insignificant moments. I was a very hard on my sleeve kind of person. Perhaps I still am, but even more so when I was 26. And so in a way, it kind of regrew on me. Like I was feeling embarrassed about all the emotional some of the stuff you're talking about, Adam, through the week. And then I just said, fuck it, and re-embraced it.
All right.
The first like 3 times I listened through it, I think I was like, it's safe to say I was actively angry at you guys for making me listen to this album over and over. But by listen number 4, you do. I agree with that. You kind of catch on, you get in the mood, you see what he's going for, you start thinking like, oh, maybe this is like veering into concept album territory. I think there is something there, and I don't actively hate this album the way I did the first few times I re-listened. You have to give it some space to kind of grow on you and to really get into those lyrics and dig into what he's trying to say. The angstiness does come through to the point that in some verses, and again, maybe this is like a male-female thing, but some of the things he's saying are so super cringy. You're just like, no, 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 no. Like some dude in a Patagonia vest, the aforementioned Patagonia vest, is gonna like take this and try and say this shit to me, and I'm gonna have to like run out of the Chili's screaming, right? Like this is not
Sizzling fajitas in hand.
Okay, yeah, I'm taking the fajitas with me. Like I'm getting the free dinner, let's be clear. But
No, that's fair. And I will happily lodge some complaints when Jeff Tweedy is being, let's say, extra. But ultimately, that guy who quotes Wilco, that's not Wilco's fault. And that's what makes me call it outsider art to a certain extent, or weird pop, or this personal document. It reminds me a little bit of Nutra Milk Hotel's record, the In the Airplane Over the Sea, or the Shins debut, or the Unicorns record that we always talk about. It just feels like it was made for the people making it, and then it happened to become popular. And I will say this too, and watching the documentary about the piece really brought this home. They were a fairly standard rock band. They could have taken these songs in a lot of directions. With that context, it helped me reappreciate how interesting, weird is the only word I can think of to describe the production. They just make a lot of weird choices that I don't think I would have made. I don't know why they made them. I'm not even saying they're good, but they're not lazy. It's very poured over.
Sure.
Everything you've all said, I think, is true to an extent. And this is one of those types of albums where I just full stop love this album. It's sort of one of these modern, semi-modern classics for me. I'll count anything that was made while I was an adult as a classic, even though, it's going on 23 years old. But I also am not going to convince somebody that they should like this, although I guess that's my kind of role in this whole exercise tonight.
You misread the job description.
I like it. That's great. If you don't, let's all just hold hands. But no, I can see why people don't like it. And I also went 12 rounds with this record. My relationship with this record feels a little bit like, Rocky and Apollo Creed, where they beat the shit out of each other a bunch of times and then they're best friends after that, right? And where I've kind of come to on this, and if I boil it down to what I like most about it, the essence for me is, from a pure listening perspective, it never loses its flavor. I've listened to this at least 100 times, and I can't imagine there being a time where someone's like, hey, do you want to listen to Yankee Hotel Foxtrot? And I'm like, nah. Every time I hear it, there's something else I pick up on. And to Rob's point earlier, in my mind, I think it's a very rare mix of great songwriting, great instrumentation, great collaboration, and I think really smart production as well. And one of the quotes that I think also kind of sums up this record to an extent is the documentary that you referenced earlier, Rob, also called I'm Trying to Break Your Heart by this guy, Sam Jones, which we'll talk about a decent bit in this episode. But early on, there's a quote from Jay Bennett, who was one of the members of Wilco at the time, who we'll also talk about a good bit because he's pretty central to the story. But he says about the songs on the record, without a sonic landscape behind you, everything turns into a folk song. So we wanted to have some sonic weight under all of it. And I think what he's getting at is, if you strip a lot of the stuff down, what you're left with are pretty subdued singer-songwriter-y guitar songs, and wrapped in some pretty serious sonic ear candy, I think. And what I have found most sort of contradictory about the things that I like, and what has surprised me most about why I like it, is I'm not really a folk guy. I'm not a singer-songwriter guy. I'm also not really into noise and effects and synths and all that stuff. But something about it all just works for me, and I want to say it's greater than the sum of its parts, but the parts are really good. So I guess it's sort of equal to the sum of its parts, right?
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I also agree that not everyone is going to like this, and that's perfectly fine with me. And we're not even really here to adjudicate that. You guys can continue to dislike it at the end of this. It's not going to affect my personal experience with it. But Dimery put it on this list. Our quest is to figure out if it is truly essential to have listened to it. And spoiler alert, I suspect it's worthy.
Challenge accepted.
We shall see. We shall see. I think we're already onto a little bit of an interesting dynamic here. The last thing I'll just say about, kind of my final impressions before getting into the story of the album is, Rob, I got to shout you out because you actually gave me a burned copy of the CD when I came to visit you guys in San Francisco back in like 2006.
Nice.
And I remember you asking me like, oh, are you into Wilco? And I said no because I was only familiar with the album AM, which, Jen, you've talked about already. I didn't like it at the time. I think it was more to do with somebody I was working with at a restaurant played it all the time, and I didn't really like that guy. So I just never gave it a fair chance. So, Rob, you gave me this CD, and my method of getting back to Eugene was, for some strange reason, a 10-hour Greyhound bus ride.
Jesus.
So I popped this into my Sony Discman, if you can believe that. I gave up on it so many times on that ride, but I just kept coming back to like, dude, you got 8 hours left. Just keep listening to it. And
You had one CD.
This is it. We got to get comfy.
It's a very high stakes trip.
Yeah.
But ultimately, by the time I got back to Eugene, I was ready to shed blood for this album. Like, it was imprinted on me. And so I do think that has something to do with it, just getting those incessant reps early on. So we've talked a little bit about some of the circumstances around this album, but I do think the context around how this record was made, the way it was released, how much the band changed afterwards is almost as much a part of the story as the music itself. And, there's a lot of different aspects of the record that we'll dive into. But first, let's just talk about Wilco as a band, because sometimes I think of them as a household name at this point. They have won a Grammy. They've been around for 20, 30 years at this point, but I'm still not sure like the average person on the street knows who they are. Right, Adam?
Or the average person on this call.
But Adam, you must have heard of this band though, right?
Not until we had that.
It was Mermaid Avenue. Yeah.
Was it Mermaid Avenue? It was like 100 episodes ago or something like that. I
feel like they're everywhere. Yeah. They were on Parks and Rec, for Christ's sake.
Never watched it.
What is your problem, Adam?
Let's get to the real issues
I represent the everyman for this episode.
Yeah, no, you don't. No, you don't.
Adam's actually proving my less than scientific claim here, which is that they're not a household name. I think if you know them, you know them, but clearly they're not that known. But Adam is right. Longtime listeners will know we did actually cover Wilco on the show before, going back to episode 62 with the Billy Bragg Mermaid Avenue collaboration, where they took a bunch of old Woody Guthrie poems and turned them into songs. But we didn't get much into the band at that time. If I'm not mistaken, that did not make the list despite my best efforts to convince the group that it does belong.
I don't think that was their best effort, certainly, yeah. I might have voted against it. I can't really remember what I said on that call, Alan, but I'm going to guess I voted against it.
Well, episode 62 feels like a century ago in podcast time. But so Yankee Hotel Foxtrot was Wilco's fourth studio album, and the personnel on that record consisted of Jeff Tweedy, guitar, lead vocals, primary songwriter. Like, he's the guy. It's his band. And that dynamic was majorly tested throughout the making of this record, most specifically as it relates to the next member of the band, who I name dropped earlier. And that's a guy named Jay Bennett, who I would describe as kind of like the ultimate X factor, especially on this record. He's multi-instrumentalist, played guitars, keys, synth. He was also heavily involved, at least early on, with mixing the record, and that part, which we'll get into shortly, was a big catalyst for him actually being fired from the band as soon as they finished recording this record. Then you had John Stearett on bass, who, aside from Jeff Tweedy, has been the only constant member of the band up until this point. So you guys shit on bassists all you want, but we're the ones providing stability in a world of psychotic guitar players out there.
It's like, I got no opinions, boss. Just tell me what to play.
Tell me what root notes we got. Oh, he sings harmony too. He can give some heft to Tweedy's vulnerable vocals, I guess.
I actually think the bass gets it on this record. I've heard a bunch of Wilco records since this record as well, and Yeah, I think they're a tight band.
Totally. Then sort of rounding out the roster for this record, you've got Leroy Bach. So great name for a musician, by the way.
Oh,
He's
hell yeah.
playing keys and a few other things. And then finally you have Glenn Kochi on drums, who was actually brought in after they fired their previous drummer early on in the recording sessions. So you're already seeing a little bit of some of the dysfunction of the band, or at least the moving parts. Now, back to Wilco themselves, they don't have any hits with a capital H, but they are considered one of the preeminent indie rock bands of our era, and a group that, although they outright reject this categorization, or at least Jeff Tweedy certainly does, are viewed as the pioneers of what came to be called alt country. And it's exactly what it sounds. It's a blending of alternative rock, hard rock, mixed with country, folk, Americana, that sort of thing. And I think the reason they reject that label so much is because that term really traces back to Tweedy's pre-Wilco days in a band called Uncle Tupelo. Now, I won't spend a ton of time on them, but I think it's important to kind of tee up what they did and how they morphed into Wilco ultimately. Uncle Tupelo was a band that Jeff Tweedy formed in 1987 in his hometown of Belleville, Illinois, with a high school friend named Jay Farrar. Now, a little bit about Jeff Tweedy, because again, we didn't cover him extensively in the last episode, and a little bit about the town he grew up in, because I think it helps a lot of his whole way of being make some sense. As I mentioned, he grew up in Belleville, Illinois, which is basically a suburb of St. Louis. Not totally rural, but he describes it as a fairly depressed town, kind of isolated, lots of alcoholism in the town. It paints a portrait that I feel like I can kind of relate to, having grown up, like most of us on this call, in Wilmington, Delaware. To give you just an idea of this town that he grew up in, though, Jeff Tweedy, in his memoir, which I had a chance to go through, he talks about working at this liquor store in high school. And before he was even drinking age, he became a manager at this liquor store, and he had to make the nightly cash deposits to the bank every night. So the owner of the store would send him with a loaded gun that he never trained him how to use or how to even take it out of its holster.
Jeez.
The good old days.
Seriously.
That's got country music written all over it, man.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Dad worked for the railroad, as did one of his older brothers, who, in a completely unrelated story, his older brother who worked at the railroad had an incident where he was accidentally buried in gravel and got a sizable settlement from the railroad company. And that settlement is actually what basically funded Jeff Tweedy's first decent guitar, which is the venerable Fender Telecaster.
Wow.
Nice.
So I guess he got unburied in the gravel also, or no, that was the end of him.
Surprise.
No, he died, but Jeff Tweedy got a guitar. So it's all good. But Wilco was formed, so the brothers' sacrifice was worth it.
It all worked out.
He made it out. But anyway, so it kind of gives you an idea. But he had another brother who did make it out of the town and went to college and kind of became this hipster audiophile who ended up giving his entire record collection to Jeff. And that's what spurred his love of music, especially a love of punk music and things that were kind of coming out at that time that were not very mainstream or well known. He dabbled with guitar a bit at a young age, but he describes always having a series of shitty guitars that were unplayable, that probably needed fret work. So he just put it back in his closet until I think this was in high school, he had like a really bad bicycling accident, and he had to basically spend the entire summer in his bedroom by himself, nursing his wounds from this accident. And when I first read it, I was like, we've all been in a bike accident. Come on. But he describes it was like pretty gruesome. And so I think that also maybe impacted his mood and his worldview. But that's when he basically decided to throw himself into guitar and learn how to play music.
Nice. Well, kind of. I was thinking, like, we're over the era of where somebody gets a record collection and then discovers their love of music. Like an event like that triggered something in his head where now, like, our kids just have every song ever written on a device. You know what I mean? Like, there's no trigger or influence from, obviously we play music around our kids that we like, but that doesn't exist anymore. Here's 500 records from my father. And then you go through all of them, and it's this experience. Now, I don't know.
I don't think anything can replace the cool older sibling recommendation engine. Spotify's never gonna get that right. And especially, I'm assuming part of what Alan's talking about is that era of DIY, early indie, right? That we've referenced many times in the show throughout the 80s, kind of leading up to Nirvana breaking, but the Mudhoneys and Black Flags of the world and the zine culture, stuff that was not that easy to find unless you were an outsider.
Totally. And he also talks about going to, he was very close with his mom. He almost describes it as a bit of a codependency, maybe an unhealthy type of relationship, but she would go grocery shopping and he would just spend the entire time reading music magazines on the shelf and just starting to figure out who these bands were. And, so he starts playing guitar and he pretty much decided right away that he was not in the camp of, I'm going to learn a bunch of theory, scales and modes. He wanted to just write songs. And that actually became his reputation early on. So much so that he talks about a time when he overheard Jay Farrar telling somebody else at a show, like, oh, Jeff, he knows how to write songs. And that was like the most compliment he ever got from Jay Farrar, he says. But that sort of spoke to, in some ways, Rob, I think he reminded me of like your approach to songwriting, where it was almost like a compulsion, where I'm going to work and, I just have to create until I can't take it anymore, basically. And he always took that very workman-like approach, writes a song a day, still does. He actually wrote a book about his process of songwriting.
That's amazing. And of course, that's very high praise. Thank you. I'm sure I don't deserve it. But I'll just say that one of the things that influenced me is I read a Bruce Springsteen quote when I was real young. And he just said, I picked up that guitar. I knew I was never going to be the greatest guitar player in the world. I figured I had to pair it with songwriting and singing to make a mark. And that was kind of my thinking too. And maybe that was Jeff Tweedy's thinking as well.
Totally.
And you can tell Jeff Tweedy's a guy that loves music and he loves songs and he loves the composition. He has another great book called World Within a Song, where he literally goes through like 50 songs that shaped who he is. And they're very different and he tells stories about them all. So I love that about him too, that you can tell he's incorporating everything that he's taken in over all these years and kind of put it into his music. He put a whole lot of it into this particular album. Some worked, some didn't, in my opinion. But you can tell that he loves music. He loves songs. He loves writing. He loves the composition. He loves arranging. That comes through loud and clear to me. Anytime Jeff Tweedy's involved in anything, whether it's Wilco or his side projects, you can tell he's a music lover at deep in his heart. He was a fan first, right?
Well, I'm actually curious when we get to how this album was made, Alan, because I don't feel like the documentary was that clear on it. In terms of the other Wilco records I've heard, they seem more like they're just based on Jeff Tweedy's songs. And so I'm wondering where he fits in to the production here. It seemed like maybe he took kind of a back seat production-wise. And I wonder how that then affected some of the songwriting choices. Do you know what I mean? Was he incentivized to get stranger and weirder and take bigger swings lyrically because they were making this soundscape thing? But we'll get to it, I imagine.
Yeah, we'll get to some of that. I think the short answer to that is Jay Bennett was a big catalyst and almost like a monkey wrench in a weird way to what they were doing. Also, I think some of the climate with the recording industry at the time that was mentioned earlier was pushing them and away in different directions. So yeah, we'll definitely get into some of that momentarily. Back to Jeff Tweedy and his journey, and I won't spend too much more time on this, but ultimately he meets Jay Farrar in high school, realizes that they're both really into punk rock groups like the Ramones, Sex Pistols, Minutemen, who we've covered on the show before. But this kind of music wasn't at all popular in this area. So again, this is, suburban St. Louis in the late 80s. So it was all country music all the time. They ultimately start an iteration of the band that would become Uncle Tupelo. And the sound that it came up with was this unusual hybrid of high energy rock mixed with Americana. It's a pretty new sound that eventually took on that descriptor of alt country.
Kind of sounds like what the Byrds did, but okay.
Well, look, it's in cycles, Rob. You have to get with the times. We forget everything that happened, 10
it's
years
just
ago.
hard. I mean, maybe I'm out of place, but it's hard to imagine that was really innovative, but it's possible. Or just a reaction to what was popular at the time, perhaps.
Where I think you see it show up most is in looking at some of the live shows that they did. It was pretty high energy. It was almost... it wasn't punk-esque, but they were trying to go for the energy of a punk show, but with the country kind of twang. And
Yeah.
I do think that was something that was a little different. And you're also layering in like the alternative that was starting to happen in like the late 80s, early 90s. So it's a bit different, but I catch what you're saying. So they never made it big, especially on a commercial level, but they were well known and were credited for having, pioneered this genre. But right as they were about to really take that next leap, Jay Farrar basically quit the band out of nowhere. And the reason he gave was that he couldn't work with Jeff Tweedy anymore. In his book, Tweedy talks about some one-off incidents. There was a time when he was drunk and Jay thought he was like making moves on his girlfriend or something that he brought up a few years later. But I think ultimately it was just creative and personal differences. And so their paths really diverged at that point, with Jay going on to form a band that Jen referenced earlier called Sunvolt. Jeff Tweedy and the rest of the band just carried on, but under the name Wilco.
You said they never made it big, which is true, but I mean, they had a record contract. They put out a few albums, right?
Oh, yeah. They put out 4 albums. They were on the precipice. So I think probably the high water mark, that for them, they did get a chance to play on the Conan O'Brien show back in the early days. Jay had already actually quit the band by that point, but they kept touring so they could pay back someone who had invested in the band. So they were like knocking on the door.
Right.
They had a cult following, but they just hadn't really had that massive break yet.
I want to put musical success in context sometimes, because that's so much farther than any of us could have dreamed of getting.
Yes. Correct.
Without question. But compared to what has happened with Wilco, who's had this decades-long career, it maybe pales in comparison to what they've done.
They even appeared on a hit sitcom that Adam didn't watch.
And not that these guys were in competition, but there was an aspect of like the indie music media such that it was at the time that was kind of trying to pit these guys against each other. And I do think it was tough for Jeff Tweedy at first, because the first Sunvolt album actually did much better commercially and critically than Wilco's first release, which was called AM. And AM was very much a continuation of Uncle Tupelo, definite country vibes mixed with alternative rock. I would argue is probably not the best representation of what they came to sound like, but I have come to appreciate that record a lot more over the years. So they released AM. After that, they released their follow-up, which is really when they started to break away from the all-country thing and radically changed their DNA when they hired Jay Bennett, so a second Jay to confuse things. And he helped them write and record a double LP called Being There, which is also on Dimery's list, which was a little bit of a surprise to me, to be honest. I think it's cool, but a little surprised to see that one on the list.
I think by comparison to this record, it does sound a little more straight ahead, but made a splash probably in the indie world at the time.
Yeah, that's fair. So Jay Bennett claims that he was really brought in to play guitar, but he had this like mad scientist, multi-instrumentalist kind of thing going on that added a totally different element to what they were doing. And so he just over time ends up getting more and more involved. He ends up doing a lot of their mixing, playing all kinds of instruments. And I think that starts to account for like the wild shit you hear on this record. They ended up releasing a third album called Summer Teeth. And this is though where Jay Bennett's imprint is on things, but his involvement starts to become more problematic with the band, where he's becoming tough to work with. He started getting really hell-bent on using instruments on songs, even if they weren't the right choice for the songs. He's also clearly becoming addicted to opiates at that time, as was Jeff Tweedy. So there were tons of pills around the studio all the time. And the record label, which at the time was Reprise Records, they were still really into Wilco, but by this point, the albums were not selling as much as they wanted to, even though Wilco was starting to sell out theaters and becoming critical darlings, but it didn't seem like there was an obvious path to becoming commercially viable for the label, which brings us to Yankee Hotel Foxtrot. So a big part of the story with the record is the manner that it was actually released. So technically it was self-released by the band on their website on what was supposed to be 9/11, so September 11th, 2001. And then a day or two before that, they decided to push it back a week for some technical reasons, obviously unrelated to what would happen on September 11th.
Notice that they still have a song on there called Ashes of American Flags. Like, it feels weirdly prescient, right? There's a few spots on there that feel, there's a tall building shake. lying on there. It must have felt real surreal when it came out. Or sorry, maybe to them when 9/11 happened.
Yeah, war on war. I mean, all of it.
Totally. And that actually, there's been a kind of a red herring about this record that people assume that there is a connection because, the album cover, there's two towers with a beige background. It's not the Twin Towers. It's actually the Marina City complex in Chicago.
Dude, this is crazy. You're putting this all together, man. Wait, produced by Taliban. There it is. Oh, I didn't notice that. Damn it.
Yeah. So there's all these different coincidences, and they're just that. It's a coincidence. But I will say there's like a melancholy aspect to this album that I do think it does fit the vibe of the country at the time, I think.
Well, they were probably responding to the George Bush era and the Supreme Court deciding for George Bush, which a lot of people felt like that was a stolen election from Al Gore. And, that was definitely the vibe even leading into September 11th.
Fair. Now, back to this being self-released by the band, which is an important part of this story. It was actually picked up and then given a proper studio release by None Such Records 7 months later on April 23rd, 2002, which might not seem like an odd thing today with how much people self-publish, put their own stuff out. But back then, these record companies were basically lumbering dinosaurs that were just getting hit with a digital asteroid in the form of internet streaming. This was when Metallica was going to war with Napster and things were starting to sort out legally.
Oh, jeez. Yeah, right.
That was so ahead of its time. So insanely ahead of its time. I just looked up for context. I remember that when Radiohead released In Rainbows in 2007, they released it as a pay what you will model on their website. And that was revolutionary.
Man.
Yeah.
And this is way before that.
Yeah. As you'll learn, their hand was a little bit forced. So even Jeff Tweedy will say, everyone says like, oh, what a stroke of brilliance. But really, they didn't have a lot of options at the time, as you'll see momentarily. But this was really like the Wild West for music distribution at that time. And on that note, I asked ChatGPT to hypothesize what would have been the most illegally downloaded songs back in 2001. I want to see if you all can guess which ones made that list. I've got a list of 4 songs and curious. Okay. Adam, I think one of them will get you excited, but...
Is it a Creed song?
Close.
Hoobastank's The Reason?
No.
Michelle Branch. No, I don't know. I need some options.
Okay. Well, here's what they are. Just to give you a little sense, this is very unscientific. In the End by Linkin Park, Rollin' by Limp Bizkit. Adam, that's what made me think of you.
My God.
I hate Limp Bizkit.
Wow.
Thanks.
Adam should take that as a serious insult.
That is an insult.
You need to throw your glove down and demand satisfaction after that. I like
System of a Down. Not...
You can challenge me to a duel. No, I say that because I feel like I have heard you constantly doing the rolling.
So, yeah. Hands up now, hands down. What you gonna do now? Yes, that is my Fred Durst impression that occasionally creeps up. So
that's actually the whole reason I came today. Was I was hoping
was for that. All right,
for a Fred Durst impression. Yeah, that's what I needed. All right, bye guys. No.
Well, it only took us an hour to get there. Our work here is done. Yeah, right. Thank you. So. At this time, the record companies were getting really skittish about what they would put out. They were getting a lot more risk averse, and that was especially true for Reprise Records, which was set to release this record. And they weren't seen as being a guaranteed commercial thing, and they still didn't have the cachet to really force feed such an experimental record. And what happened was they end up recording this. They submitted it to Reprise in June of 2001, and the label rejected it almost immediately. Basically said, we can't put this out. It's not going to make any money. You had the cliche, we don't hear a single, but it was also so experimental and different from what they had done before that they just looked at it as an obvious loss.
Well, let's talk about the lumbering dinosaur thing just for a second, because I think what may be easy to miss is the idea that, yeah, they paid them to make it in the studio, right? But then if they're going to release it, it's not just about, it's partially the cost of printing the records, but they got to distribute it, they got to market it. The cost has to be like 10x from there if they're ever hoping to recoup or make it a hit, right? And so that is a big and valid, frankly, business milestone for a company to jump off at.
Totally. And the backdrop of all this, too, was that there was a lot of upheaval with Reprise at the time, and there was all these mergers happening. And so not only did they refuse to release this, but they ended up actually dropping Wilco from the label entirely because they refused to change any of it. And what was one of a series of moves that ended up being like a total self-boosh on the part of Reprise was that they gave away the rights of this album to Wilco and then ostensibly bought them back under a different subsidiary like 6 months later.
Well, so is it true? I heard a rumor that they heard the album. They said, we're not releasing it, like no question. And it sounded like from the documentary that there wasn't even a real discussion about here's what you should change. You know, Wilco, not that they would have been open to that, but it's not like the record label was even engaging in those kinds of discussions. But then, like, why did they give the record back is what I'm trying to get at. I thought it was they heard there was some groundswell of like, do not do this. They're a much beloved, the fans are super loyal and they have a lot of friends in show business and things like that.
Yeah, good question. So Reprise was a subsidiary of, and this is going to get into some corporate nonsense here with mergers and acquisitions, but they were a subsidiary of a recently formed merger that was created out of AOL Time Warner. As part of that merger, they laid off hundreds of people, one of whom was the president of Reprise, this guy Howie Klein, who was Wilco's biggest supporter within the franchise, I guess. He almost certainly would have released it as is, but the guy they put in charge after he left was much more of a pop guy, and I think his big success story was pushing Sugar Ray into the mainstream. So he's the guy actually who allegedly dropped that quote I mentioned in the intro about it possibly being a career killer for the band. What started to happen was they didn't want anything to do with the record, and Wilco's legal team actually negotiated a $50,000 buyout that the band would pay to Reprise that would give them the full rights to take the album and do whatever they want with it. Gets to your point, Rob. The news started to leak that they were dropping Wilco, and it wasn't that it was a huge groundswell, but they were starting to get some bad press around dropping them, and they actually started getting worried that other bands wouldn't want to work with them anymore. So basically they just cut their losses and said, you can have it for free. Take it. You're free agents. Do whatever you want with it.
Wow.
Oh, man.
That is such a windfall.
Yeah.
And very rare at the time. Like, it was not happening to a lot of bands at that time. And what started happening was a lot of the singles started leaking online. And so people started showing up to Wilco shows already knowing the words to these songs that hadn't been released yet. So that's when they said, we're just going to release it on our website, and started to get some traction. They end up shopping it around, and it gets picked up by None Such Records, who again is a subsidiary of this same conglomerate who gave it to them in the first place.
Probably when they released it on their website, did they even have a way of making money off it at that moment? Like, I feel like the infrastructure around paying for music was just way less mature at that time. They certainly weren't getting any streaming money because streams weren't a thing.
No, I think they just put it out as an offering.
Just have it, yeah. Because that's what I'm saying. I think by the time Radiohead came around, did the In Rainbows thing, that was revolutionary, partly because what the band was doing, but also because you had a band set up their own payment system where you could enter an amount of money and go through a thing. It's just hard to flash back to a time when technology was this antiquated. They really had no choice but just to give it away.
Well, yeah, they had no choice, but also it started to get them a little bit of buzz. People were talking about them. It probably was leading to more people going to shows and things like that. But ultimately, again, 6 months later, they did sell it to an agency, so they still needed to monetize it in that way. And the record has gone on to sell enough copies that made it a pretty dismal business decision for Reprise, which leads us into our favorite segment of this podcast called By the Numbers.
Woo!
So let's start with the number 600,000, which is the number of copies that this album has sold since that formal release.
Damn.
I don't know how much labels were making off each album back in the day, but even if it's $5 an album, you're into the several millions of dollars at this point that they just straight up gave away.
Well, also just take a beat to realize just how wrong they were and how weird a record it is to be selling that much, whether it's the lyrics or the production. We all agreed it's not for everybody. So it's kind of bizarre that it is a hit.
That I agree with. Yeah. I hate to see artists make bad decisions. We talk about all the time, but I don't really mind when it happens to a record label. Let's be honest.
The record companies.
Dude, why don't they just, it feels like the same lesson gets wrought on history again and again. You are the one that chose the artist to do the thing they do. And then even paid for it, and then you just don't want to follow through with that for some reason. When the artist's like, this is what I want to do, you're like, nope, I changed my mind. You don't know what you're talking about anymore.
But isn't that a survivor bias? Like, you don't know how many terrible bands they said no to, that if they had brought them on, they'd be bankrupt.
Yeah, there is that. But Alan mentioned that there was turnover within the company, right? And that was a part of it. Somebody who was a fan of them agreed. But theoretically, you should trust your original instinct. You made the decision to bring them on and make this record because we believe that what you make will be good because we trust you. You're the creative. You handle creative. And then you're going back on that decision after you're, whatever, $60,000 in the hole for making the record. That's stupid.
Well, unless he did to like walk into the studio and see like opioids everywhere and was like, I wonder what this is going to sound like. And then gives it a listen and is like, oh, it sounds like the whole band's on opioids. Maybe we want to hold it.
Yes.
Some weird auto harp or something laying in the corner. Like, what are all these
What's happening?
these obscure instruments on the floor?
Is that a glockenspiel I see?
Well, this is actually a perfect segue into my next number on the list, which is the number 20, which is a rough estimate of the number of instruments that Jay Bennett played on this record. Among the more interesting ones were pump organs, which I wasn't even sure what that was, toy pianos, as mentioned earlier, manual tape loop effects, and what Jay described as, quote, artificially generated orchestra sounds. Whatever the hell that means.
So the pump organ is interesting in areas where organs weren't yet electrified. You would actually have two pedals. Kind of like if you think the old school sewing machine, you'd use your feet. The pump organ had two bellows, essentially, that you would pump and essentially run in place and get into a rhythm where you were blowing enough air constantly into the reeds and you would play the organ. It's a very weird, almost ancient sounding wooden kind of thing.
Clearly, we need another one of those for our next recording venture.
Or pump organ.
Bring me my dulcimer.
So next number is 10, which is the score out of 10 that this record received from Pitchfork at the time, which I can't tell if I like it more or less after hearing that review, but I think in retrospect they were onto something with that.
I think this is where Jen's initial criticism resonates with me, that this is, in a way, it's the beginning of the 21st century hipster. I don't exactly think that's Wilco's fault, and that vibe has since been co-opted and become the standard for lame dudes everywhere who don't go out and cultivate their own identity, but instead just go to Urban Outfitters and buy whatever shirts they have there. So I get it. It fits.
Yes.
Next number is 5,000, which is the estimated number of cigarettes seemingly smoked throughout this documentary. If you've watched this there's not a scene where someone doesn't have a cigarette hanging out of their mouth. I mean, Jay's playing keyboards with like a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. It's like, how are you even enjoying that? I just thought that was a really funny part of the documentary.
I noticed that too. He's constantly has the cigarette hanging out, and I don't know if Jeff Tweedy had some kind of editing rights on the documentary, but Jay Bennett does not come off well in that. He comes off like a dick.
He does. We'll talk a little bit about that momentarily, but yeah, it beats him up a good bit, and I think it does crush his public image a little bit in a way that I think some deserved, some, maybe not, but not a flattering portrait for sure. The last number is number 5, which is the number of dollars it costs per month to join our Patreon community at the premium level. Which I gotta say, I've been going in there a good bit. The commentary in there is getting pretty good, and I feel like it's giving me a run for my money on this program. Definitely check it out. You'll have access to a lot of our bonus content, things like our song battle series, and my personal favorite, which is our guilty pleasures series, which gives you a chance to boosh us right back for some of our terrible choices in the music we listen to when we think nobody is around.
And thank you, Alan. We have just started releasing our song battle Say My Name edition, which was very contentious, I should tell you.
Yes.
So you're definitely going to want to check that out. The theme was songs with women's names in the title, and we got some pretty outlandish submissions.
Love that. But look, if you're oversubscribed or afraid to make the commitment, there's definitely a lot you can access at the free level. And of course, in general, leaving a review on the podcast, subscribing, telling a friend, all that stuff really goes a long way to help us grow this thing and amplify our complaints far and wide. So thank you all for that so far. Getting back to the recording here, as we've alluded to a bunch of times here, the other big aspect of this recording that's played a big part in the lore of the album was Jeff Tweedy's relationship with Jay Bennett. The documentary covers some aspects of it, but it doesn't fully explain why things fell apart with him and the band. They do show an argument between the two of them about the way one of the songs fades into a different song, like where the cut should be made. But honestly, I've fought with everyone on this call, except for Jen, probably about stuff like that a million times.
Yeah.
And so when you watch it, you don't think you're like, okay, that seems like a pretty normal argument.
Agreed. All very standard band arguments from the documentary's perspective.
In Tweedy's memoirs, where he goes a lot more into depth about the relationship, and he talks about really the way Jay was starting to become super shady about his role in the band. So he was really subverting everybody behind their back. It was becoming a situation where if you weren't in the room with him, he was talking shit about you. And if Jeff wasn't there, he was undermining Jeff to the band. If it was Jeff and Jay just sitting there mixing, he would say something like, hey, we don't need the rest of the band. Like, we can record all this ourselves. And it was just this series of behaviors that were unhealthy and toxic to a collaborative partnership. There was one scene that kind of ties some of this all together with all the instruments and Jay Bennett's, kind of weirdness, where for whatever reason, and I can't recall which song this shows up on the album, but Jeff Tweedy describes a scene where him and Jay agreed to turn on all these different instruments. They're basically taping together keys on the keyboard so that it would just sort of lay out in a weird way, and that they would leave it all on overnight so that they would come back the next morning to this cacophony of insane sounds.
I like the idea that letting it marinate for 12 hours is going to be somewhat different than 12 seconds of it.
That's some real Brian Wilson shit right there.
Yeah.
Right.
That's call the guy with the big net to come put it over your head.
This is already kind of crazy enough, but I think what irked Jeff about this was that the next morning when he came back to the studio, Jay was already there showing the film crew around, being like, hey, look at this thing I did. I did this thing last night, and look at it. And it was just all these unhealthy, toxic, it's all about me things. There were some issues with him thinking that he was going to mix the album, but they didn't like the mixes he was doing. And so Jeff Tweedy secretly brought in Jim O'Rourke, who's another indie rock guy, multi-instrumentalist, who's either played with or produced music for bands like Stereolab, Sonic Youth, bunch of other people. So they actually asked him to just mix one of the songs as like a proof of concept, and they all loved it so much that they just had him end up mixing the entire rest of the record. And then the tensions just started to grow, so much that finally Jeff fired Jay from the band as soon as the recording was done. And I will say, it's one of those things that sounded like it needed to happen in order for the band to survive. But in my mind, they were never the same after this. I think they still made some good music, and some of the records after this I would rank among my favorites of theirs, but this was just such a high watermark that I think it took something major away from the band, even if it was what enabled them to survive in the first place.
Let me comment on that, because I think it's important. One of the reasons I think we respect bands on this show, this is one of our points of agreement, is the idea that you have to keep moving forward. You have to keep evolving. So let me just say right off the bat, I'm glad they did not even attempt to repeat this success and remake Yankee Hotel Foxtrot or make a sequel to it. That said, I think they're also a band that's interested enough in reinvention. I think the next great Wilco record is the one where they added Nels Cline to the band, because he's just like a force of a guitar player, changes the color of the music. Anyway, that's my example of why I do think it's a band that's at least attempting to strive and evolve.
I agree with that. He was definitely not a direct replace. They did do one album in between those called A Ghost Is Born, and I think Sky Blue Sky is what you're referring to, Rob, with Nels Cline.
Yeah. Sky Blue Sky is great.
He does usher in kind of a new chapter for the band, but I think in totality, the work never quite lived up to this, but that's common, to have that high watermark for bands, I think.
And I'm okay with that. That's what I'm saying. You can't redo an experimental masterpiece. It's just not going to happen. So why try?
Good point. The last thing I'll just say about Jay Bennett and his departure from the band is I do think the documentary did him a little bit dirty with some of the categorizations. Specifically, there's a scene where I think it's the manager or like the lawyer of the band, and he's talking about how Jay wore out his welcome, but then he makes this comment about now he has to get used to playing in front of 35 people instead of playing in front of sold out stadiums, and it shows him in like some high school gym playing guitar, and I thought that was a little fucked up.
That's rough.
That's mean.
Counterpoint, he is a white guy with dreads. So.
Oh, so he may deserve.
That is a good point. I don't know how that didn't come up already. That's already grounds for dismissal. All right. Well, we've done enough talking, I think, about the context. Let's get into some of the songs here. Let's dive back into the song that we kicked off the episode with, which is I Am Trying to Break Your Heart.
This is definitely a cool opening track, right? I literally had no idea what to expect. Again, my first exposure was that Mermaid album of covers, and this was super weird. So it at least had my attention. That weird fake opening with the drums, it's like a false start. Felt like a Radiohead album. It was pretty cool. I dug it. It was, again, a good start.
Perfect thing to start the record. Probably the best track on the album, although it doesn't really work outside the context of the album, I would say. So it's not like I'm putting this on a mixtape.
Right.
But, and I heard some reviewer call this an Americana Kid A, which I think was pretty right on.
Yeah.
For what this is getting at. Now, that said, the imagery here bounces between indelible and impressionistic and borderline unintelligible nonsense. But I'm here for it. I'm here for it, dude.
I don't love this song. I don't love this song. I think you're right. I think the only place it can go on this album is as the opening track. I think that I do agree with that part. I don't think you can put this song anywhere else. But why is it 6 minutes? Like, why is this song so long? And tell me that I'm wrong. He sounds like the teacher from Charlie Brown. It's like wah 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 wah. Like that's just the monotony of this song. Like I just couldn't. And I get some of the like cuckoo lyrics, and I know that there's lore out there about this is like his homage to when he was an alcoholic and drinking so much, and so some of the nonsense is kind of like alluding to that. But I'm like, really? Like you're quite a quiet domino, bury me now. Like, what is he talking about? Like,
I think he hits as many out of the park as he completely whiffs, though. That's what I would say. I think.
Really, do you love an American aquarium drinker?
I love that line. I think it's an excellent line. I think I assassin down the avenue is an excellent line.
How does he make assassin a verb? Like, you can't just do that. Like, I don't know.
What do you mean?
I can actually tell you how, not that I study the lyrics on all these songs, but for that specific one, I actually do like that turn of phrase, I assassin down the avenue, but he talks about this in his book, and he cites this specifically that parts of this song were actually some sort of writing exercise or a writing prompt. And he had something that said, I assassinate down the avenue. And the meter didn't work. And so he just like lopped off one word of it. In some senses, it's meaningless, but it has taken on meaning, I guess. I do think it's a cool turn of phrase.
I don't think it's meaningless at all. I reject meaningless entirely. I think it is impressionistic, and it's using the malleability of the English language to get to something new. But I think we all know what he's talking about. Now, there are other lyrics that are terrible, Jen, to be clear, but that's not one of them.
I think that he's like, it's like a joke you have to explain the punchline to, right? It's not funny anymore if you have to explain it. Like, that's my thing with this. I'm like, it's like there's so much. Take off your Band-Aid because I don't believe in touchdowns. What are you talking about?
That is one of the terrible lyrics, but you have to be able to separate these two sides of the equation. I take off your Band-Aid because you don't believe in touchdowns. I wrote that down as like, you fucking lost me, Jeff. I don't know what you're talking about. Right?
Well, what's the assassin down the avenue?
To me, this whole song, it feels like being drunk in a city at night by yourself, walking home or walking with purpose, and just trying to kind of find your way through the big city. It really hits hard, and I listened to it in that context for the first time, or the first several times.
Well, if I could have had you overdubbing your take on it, I would have liked it a lot more.
We need the Mystery Science 3000 version.
Right?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
like the pop-up video lyrics.
People commenting.
I think this lyrical style is going to take some big swings, and some are going to land and some aren't. And it is like poetry in the sense that, you know, it's for you to interpret, right? It's not really about my interpretation. It's about the ear of the beholder. So that's fine if you don't like it, but I think that some he lands really, really well, some he doesn't. But to me, the vibe of the song is very consistent with a very specific experience in my life, and I'm expressing that I'm biased because of that, because that's when I listen to it. I love it.
I do agree that he does hit on some lyrics. Like, you know, I called out some songs not from this album, but even from this album too, like he does hit. The man can write a song. He's a lyricist of the highest order. Like, no disrespect, except whenever he's lost everyone, right? I'm like, but he didn't lose you, right? He lost me, but he didn't lose Rob. So clearly you're connecting to the song in a different way, which I think is, again, the magic of a band like this, a song like this, an experimentation like this. It's going to work for some.
What about the main chorus lyric? I think that's a really solid premise for a song where he kind of turns it around every time. What was I thinking when I let go of you? What was I thinking when I said hello the first time? What was I thinking when we said goodnight? Thinking about that moment in the doorway where you could have made a move, but you didn't. You left instead. You know, to me, it just really resonates with that young adulthood.
Yeah, I'm glad he's thinking about it. I'm glad as a young dude, he's thinking about it. At least he's not just like blaming everybody or screaming about like why he hates this girl. So I do think that it's thoughtful. I just think it was too confusing. It was too long. Then at the end, you get all like the weird noises and it becomes hard to follow again. Like around like the 420 mark, ironically, of the song, it kind of goes in a different direction. It starts to feel like it's coming together, and then you get like 2 more minutes of bonkers.
It's indulgent. There's no denying it's indulgent and excessive. Yeah.
Yeah, that payoff around 4:15 is something I wrote where it feels like the song is starting to crescendo, and I was like, oh, I can finally kind of bob my head. They've established a piano motif. There's something happening, and then it just kind of stays there, and then just kind of, meanders out.
Yeah, but the whole thing, wouldn't you agree, is really a build-up to song 2.
Yeah, totally.
The whole record has this hang-together approach. They even reference a song at the end of this song that's later on the record, but a lot of that tension and release is happening at the track changes, I think.
Totally agree. I should also, Jen, just want to compliment you on ingratiating yourself to us by complaining about the song length. That's a staple of this program, so you're already in our good graces there. The song length wasn't what bumped me about this song. This is a tough way to start an album, I think, and this is one of the things that knocked me off course the first few times I listened to it, because maybe just that time in my life I wanted more get in, get out, and had less patience for some sonic buildup, I guess. The song itself I do think is good. The lyrics are a little goofy. I will say what I think is by far the coolest part of this song, and this is what makes it click for me why they brought this new drummer in. That drum fill at the beginning, it's just, I have never heard anything like that. It's nothing super complicated, but there's something about the way he drops that line where it ends in the bar that I just think it's cool as hell.
The exec who gets this record, and this is the first song, it is kind of one of these first track is a test to see if you're cool enough to want to go farther, like we talked about with bands like Ween. And
yeah, right.
I get it. It's a very challenging track, and I get why it's not for everybody, but I think it is also an indication of what you're going to get on the rest of the record. And yeah, you get some nice poppy breaks from that, certainly, but by and large, this defines the mission statement for Yankee Hotel Foxtrot.
All right, let's move on to the next song.
Well, Alan, you were saying that songs leaked online and they knew because people were singing along at their concerts. I'm picturing him like standing on stage. Everybody's going, cheer up, honey. He's like, oh, look, they know the words.
This song, okay, I selected this for the list as ostensibly a low point, but I do like where it ends up. But I must say, this song for me was like Shawshank, where he crawls through a mile of shit to escape from prison. Because The first part of the song is brutal. It sounds like Elliott Smith on tranquilizers. Adam, when you made the joke earlier about his intonation singing, I knew exactly that you were most likely referring to this part.
Yeah.
It's really tough. It's really tough at first.
Every time I listened to this song this week, I was thinking of Adam and how he would feel.
And I was angry and clenching my fists.
I do ultimately like it. I agree. I don't really think it's a huge standout as a low point. In fact, I think it fits pretty well with the rest of the album. And in fact, if I was going to pick a low point, I probably would have picked something like War on War. It just feels a little more like a throwaway to me. But I do get what you guys are saying. I think it is a little precious.
For this one, like I hated this one so much in the beginning. I'll read my initial note. I wrote first off, why is every song 5 minutes? I'm done. The second too is it's like a football game where there's 3 hours of standing around and replays and 15 minutes of actual live gameplay. That's what this song was like. We're listening to a bunch of noise, then 71 words. I counted them twice. Now I'm getting pissed, right? Now I'm just getting mad. Like, are you kidding me? It sounded like too like when the RPMs are too low on the record player. Like I'm like, if I could just crank it up, like
spin it up, come on.
And then it's a 2.5 minute song. I only need it once, the 71 words once, and then we can just all be done.
Oh, that's so funny. That's a great analogy, the sports where nothing good happens and then you get a little bit of a payoff if you stick it through. This was a song where I can totally understand why a record executive was like, to your point, we can't put this out.
Yeah. And it's also track 3, by the way. Like they're front loading the hardest shit to get through.
Yeah, they are testing you. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And it's not just the vocals either. It feels really ominous. Just the bass drum, the dun dun dun, it's creating a mood of, it feels very dystopian almost. Where I think it does start to pay off though is I do think when the hook comes in, it's a really nice tension and release. But even around, I made a note at 1:30 where there's like one guitar note that comes in. It's just literally like da-na, and it uplifts the song in a major way, in a very subversive way that I don't think I caught the first few times, but it's, to me, that was the magic of what Jay Bennett was doing, where he starts slowly layering in this stuff.
Oh yeah.
And it changes the color of the chords and it ultimately goes somewhere. But I do agree I could do without a lot of the build up.
I can't stress this enough, and actually maybe I didn't emphasize this enough, that on this re-listen, I really tuned in to some of these little production details. They absolutely elevate the material in a really cool way. It's just sonically very rich, and everything, all the sonics are really grimy, but there's just a lot to sink your teeth into kind of throughout the record.
I would agree with that too. I think that's what makes it more enjoyable the more you listen, because it does continue to surprise you. When upon first listen, it sounds so one note. It sounds so, I know it's not a great word, but it felt boring the first couple listens. But I think once you sort of drop in and do start getting into some of the nuances and the layering and the way they've arranged the songs, it does start working, or it starts sounding better. It starts sounding richer. It doesn't sound as one note. I wasn't as bored as I was initially. And this particular song does have one of my favorite lyrics of his. It again references the chorus where he says, "My mind is filled with radio cures, electronic surgical works." I'm like, yeah, I can totally relate to that. Like, you know, just like a song coming in and like fixing everything. Lyrically, I love that line, and I would not completely diss this song just because I think that lyric is so great. But it was a hard one initially. It took me a minute.
All right. Let's move on to the next song on our list, which is called
Totally.
It's probably my favorite set of lyrics, and I just find myself humming this one the most. You got the strings, and the strings don't stay the same through the song, which is really cool. Like the first round through, they do this nice normal string section thing, and then like at 108 they come back and do this really intense vibrato effect.
Yeah, what track is this on the album? Because this was my first time through. Again, it felt like a bit of a slog, but this was the one where my head popped up and I was like, oh,
Five.
Okay, so 5 songs in, and I woke up and I was like, oh, this is kind of nice. And again, this is where I really started to appreciate how things were recorded, how the strings felt somehow lo-fi produced. Very cool production on this. And this is where I first noticed that. Then on subsequent listens, I think I was queued up for the rest of the album.
Yeah, if this was the only song that I'd heard, I'd be so anxious to listen to the rest of the album, you know? Like if this was the one, then I'd be all in. But yeah, because they kind of, it's at track 5, you have to kind of earn it. They don't reward you until you.
It's an interesting approach for sequencing. I agree. It's a little surprising they didn't start with a tune like this, or maybe there's one or two other ones. But this record does kind of pick up steam. And it's hard to distinguish whether it's because you're getting into the vibe of the record or they're just pitching you softballs as you go through the track list.
This song is, I think it's the best song on the album. I wouldn't say it's my favorite, but it's come to be known as one of their signature songs. It's actually by a country mile their most streamed song on Spotify, by almost 60,000 streams compared to their second, which is California Stars, off of the Mermaid Avenue album. And I'm not sure I get why it would be disproportionately popular compared to the rest of the songs, but I do think it's an incredible song. I think the strings are understated enough, but they really support the song in a great way. I also think it's the kind of song that if you took all that stuff off of it, it would still, just with one guy and a guitar, sound like a really nice, pretty song. And this is probably the one that has, and maybe this goes to why it's their most popular song, is this is what has most of those 9/11 imagery aspects of it.
Oh.
Tall buildings shake, skyscrapers are scraping together,
Right.
your last cigarettes are all you can get. Intentionally or not, obviously it couldn't have been because he wrote it before then, but I do think it has that evocative character of melancholy.
I list this line as my favorite line on the record. You were right about the stars. Each one is a setting sun. That really works for me.
Damn, that's good.
This one's filled with great lyrics. Our love is all God's money. I think that's great. Again, I've not heard that before. So, I mean, definitely unique and creative for sure. He does say honey a lot, though. We noticed that. He's like, I think he says honey in every song, like he's referencing it like a slang, you know, like babe or whatever. But he's definitely not afraid to throw honeys around everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
All right. Moving on to the next track on
On the podcast, where usually the host's low light is the 4th or out of 5 songs. I want to know if this is Alan's low light because it makes sense because I really like this song. So that would make sense that I pick the worst song on the focus list.
I had Radio Cure as, I'm kind of going a little bit in sequence.
Okay, all right.
I should have
Okay,
tried to
okay.
subvert expectations a little bit, but
Well, you did. Well done.
I put this on here because maybe it's the basic in me coming out, but to me, Rob, this would be my mixtape song. Like, this is the single.
It's not the single, to be clear, though, but it should have been.
Well, the single in my mind, like if I were releasing it.
If I was the record exec, I would think this is the single, definitely.
This is actually a drum machine. There's drums that start the song, even though it's about heavy metal drummer and everything. But it is a drum machine that kicks off the song.
They just start it, though, right?
Yeah, yeah.
They don't. Yeah, then the real drummer kicks in.
Right.
You know, another great production touch on this one, they bring that drum loop back kind of subtly later in the song and in cool little snippets. Like they meld it together with the song, which is really nice.
Totally. And this was the song I mentioned earlier where it was the transition from Ashes of American Flags into this that was, causing the argument that was documented in the film. But I like sometimes not having to read into lyrics too much or try to interpret, but just I miss those heavy metal bands I used to go see on the Landing in the summer. It just evokes a period of time in life. I miss the innocence I've known, playing Kiss covers, Beautiful and Stoned. I don't know. I just think that
It's great.
it just tells you what it is, and it's not cloaked in a bunch of mystery. But to me, this just felt like the pop number of the album.
And yet again, I think the production really elevates it above and beyond that. I do think it's a fun pop number. Absolutely like the song. The use of piano here and throughout the album is very cool and sparse. And they just have a habit of not repeating the little production touches they do. The way the piano starts, the sound of the piano when the song starts, even though the piano comes back, it feels like it's warped, or maybe now it's a toy piano or something else. It's an auto harp. I don't know. But I think they do a lot of cool little things with this, including that drum loop fused in with the song in the end to make it more than just a pop song.
I noted that musically, this is my favorite track on the album. Like not lyrically, but just musically, this is my favorite. I like what they did with this. It's not the most complicated on the album. It's not the most detailed, but for whatever reason, this one is the one that I like the most musically. And like the song as a whole for me was kind of mid. I didn't love it, I didn't hate it, but musically I really connected with
And
it.
again, that transition though, where they do link the songs together, it's kind of an underrated aspect of this album. But the end of the other one does land on the resolve of the first chord here, and that's a satisfying resolution.
Yeah, for sure. And it does make it hard to decouple these things and talk about them in isolation because so much of it is meant to be listened to continuously, but a lot of great choices there. I also like the oohs and the ahs in this. Little ear candy never hurt anyone.
But then they throw in that synth bass at the end as the song is like moving out. It goes to like a synthesizer. Yeah, it's crazy, but it's really cool. It works.
All right, let's move on to the last song that we're going to talk about today. Other Wilco fans like it. It's not the kind of, you're almost certainly not going to see them play this if you go to a show. So really curious what y'all think of this one.
I like this one, and I wish that the album would have ended here. I know my message has been truncating this songs and albums here, but I really think if this album would have ended on this song, I feel like those last two tracks are kind of throwaway tracks for me. So I wish that the album would have ended here, and then it would have finished strong. We would have had that big, like really fun track 5 with Jesus, etc. in the middle. Like I think that I would have liked the album better had it stopped here because this song is really strong.
I literally had the note that I think this could have been the end of the album. I don't necessarily think the other ones are throwaway, but to me, it felt like the climax of the album. It felt like everything pulled itself into the emotional peak of this song. Like I get goosebumps even just thinking about this song. For whatever reason, it just hits me in a certain way. And so glad that you picked up on that too.
Yeah, I totally did. You know, I like the lyrics here too. I like lazy locomotives, wherever you may roll. I think you have no motive. I know you have no home. I was like, upon first listen, I'm like, is it great or is he just trying to impress us with like his sweet use of alliteration or whatever, but like the more you get into it and like this song hits so hard for me all the way through. Like you said, for some reason I really relate to this song too. And so I just really like I would have been happy to just put a bow on it here.
It would be unfair, and our listeners would yell at us if we didn't say, or if I didn't say, this record is a little too long. I do agree with that. So I agree with your sentiment. This feels like a peak. I could have dealt with cutting. I might have cut the last song, No Reservations, or Reservations, and War on War, maybe, because I do like Poor Places, and I think you could have come down and maybe made Poor Places a little shorter if I was sequencing the record, and I think it'd be more like the right length. But I hear what you're saying. It does go on a bit. Song's great, though.
Yeah, I thought this song cooked. And they do something really cool where it's a very acoustic-driven song, obviously. And there's like these really small spots where the electric guitar comes in and does like a little noodly thing, like just once in a while. It's very sparse, but when it does come in, I wanted more of it because it's got kind of a country twang. There's some bend, stays out for another 2 minutes, and then it comes in a little bit more at the end. But yeah, super tasty. And the fact that I wanted more electric guitar, good job, guys. Leave them wanting more, right?
Yeah, that little thing. So that motif, I think, in my mind, is what ties the entire song together. There's a few things. There's the motif, that little guitar riff. There's the dropout in the middle of the song where it's heavy acoustic guitar that seems like it comes out of nowhere, but it's really the backbone of the song. And in fact, I remember watching recently a live version of this, and it even had Nels Cline, and they had the horsepower to pull it off, but they didn't do those little motifs, the and Jeff Tweedy was not playing an acoustic, he was playing like a semi-hollow body, and when he hit that part in the song, it just didn't land. And so it still was a good performance, but to me, this was like the production of the song is what I think like really made this a great song in my mind.
Yeah, I could buy that. There's like that xylophone made out of beer bottles that's leading a verse.
I need to get one of those. Cool. All right. Well, look, I think we've waxed on plenty about the merits or lack thereof of this record. And so now it is time to render our verdict on whether this actually belongs on the list. Rob, what say you?
Yeah, it's an easy yes for me. I think the record is just an impressive shot at the fences. They are, in some ways, a fairly standard rock band, but Jeff Tweedy is a great songwriter. He's modern. It's just nice that someone out there is still trying to write songs and have a band and play rock and roll music. And I think that plus the choices they made to take these relatively straightforward and fairly delicate songs, but turn them into something really inventive is impressive. So it's definitely listen to this. You're going to probably have to get through the first half a few times, but you will be rewarded.
Very well. Adam.
Yeah, interesting week. I think that I probably will not go back and do a entertainment or joyful listen of this anytime in the next month. It was a bit of a slog at times. Again, not being super familiar, this being only the second album I've ever heard by these guys. But just based on the production and instrumentation alone, this was out of left field, even from the stuff we listened to on the podcast here, across decades, not just within the context of 2001. And it's weird enough, it's cool enough that I'm happy I listened to it, and it came out in the modern era, so I'm going to say you should listen to it as well. So you know what? It's a yes for me.
All right. Love to see that. Jen, what say you?
Well, if you would have asked me on Monday, I would have said the only time you need to listen to this album is before you want to take a nap. However, now that we're here, later in the week, I think that I am with you guys. Like, I think you definitely need to listen to this album because it was so innovative at the time. It was a departure. It was even a departure for Wilco, right? From what they were doing early and sort of this defining moment of alt country, which they were such a huge part of, along with Whiskey Town and some of those other bands. So I think that this is such a departure, although it doesn't reach the level of like a Pet Sounds for me. I think the comparison is apt, right? Like it is something that is different and a departure and a band that feels like they're trying to push themselves and grow and do something different. So even if you don't love it, stick with it, because I think it is an album worth listening to and taking in. And Jeff Tweedy's just like, he's an American treasure, right? Whether you love him or hate him, like the man is prolific. He writes all the time. He collaborates with everyone. I think that for that reason alone, I think Jeff Tweedy's an important person in music, modern music. And so I think you should listen to this album for that reason.
Very cool. Love that. Very, very well said. And to the surprise of nobody at this point, this is a no-brainer yes for me. And I would even go as far as to say I think albums like this are why this list was made in the first place. Everyone knows you should listen to Dark Side. Everyone knows you should listen to Sgt. Pepper. Obviously, I used a slightly clickbaity Pet Sounds reference earlier on in this episode, but everyone knows you should listen to that. And I'm not putting this into that aspect of rarefied air as one of these Mount Rushmore type of classics, but I do think it's an essential listen that, back to the point earlier, I would argue that the average person's probably not aware that this even exists. And so to me, this is the exact kind of thing that should be on a list that is looking to open people up to things that they've probably missed at some point in their listening career.
I'm not ready to put it on the Pet Sounds Sgt. Pepper pantheon either, but it is singular. I think that's all what we're saying. I can't think of something else that sounds quite like this. And rare is the modern rock album that has this much thought and effort put into its production.
For sure. All right. Well, it's a clean sweep. Reprise, you fucked up by dropping this record, but history has judged it accordingly, as has this esteemed panel. So appreciate you all weighing in, and want to also just give an extra special thanks again to Jen for jumping in, mixing it up, knowing that songs shouldn't be super long, among other great insights. Jen, tell us again where we can find your stuff, where your stuff's happening.
Yes, absolutely. You can tune in to What Are You Listening To? Every Monday, new episodes drop on any platform where you get your podcasts. We also have a show called Super Awesome Mix on the network, and a show called The Battle, which is similar to what you guys do in Song Battle. But we are this season taking an approach and listening to songs about true crime. So we're combining a couple of podcast genres here and putting true crime and music together.
Oh, nice.
Check out season 2 of The Battle, which drops on Wednesdays. So thank you guys so much for having me. I had so much fun. I love listening to the show. I've shared with Rob and I think Tom too. I go back if I have a long drive and re-listen to the Hotel California episode over and over because that's the one where it's like I'm like the girl in the movie theater screaming at the screen, like, you guys are wrong. No, no, no. What are you talking
What
about?
are you doing?
That's awesome. Well, of course, all Jen's links are going to be in the episode notes right now. Definitely go check out her podcasts, plural. Highly recommend. And Jen, I just want to extra compliment you on getting in there and complaining with us. Sometimes that's the hardest thing for a guest to do, but you did it with a plume. So nice work.
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, totally. And there's a ton of back content if you want to find things that we've been wrong about and yell at your phone or your car speaker. So there's much more than Hotel California to get mad about, but appreciate that.
That's just a favorite. That's just one that I love to go back to. There are plenty good episodes, but that's a fave. That's a fave.
Oh, all right, all right.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate it. Thanks for spending the time with us. All right. Let's move on to what we got in that old mailbag, Rob. We like to open it up to the listeners to complain about us or offer their own bouches. So what's in store for us today, Rob?
Yes, thanks, Alan. I got the old mailbag here. We got a couple good ones. First up, we have listener Philip, who writes in, I really enjoyed your review of Lynyrd Skynyrd. Your intros concerned me. He means our tweet-length reviews. But you guys ultimately recognized their musical talent. I wanted to mention that your comparison to the Joe Perry guitar style was spot on. However, you missed mentioning that the doomed plane that Lynyrd Skynyrd crashed in was Aerosmith's plane.
Whoa.
Just a cool fact you guys were not aware of. Love your show. Now, I went ahead and looked this one up, audience, and this is Rob here. I looked this one up and confirmed this from an Aerosmith biography called Walk This Way. The crash took place October 20th, 1977. The Convair CV-240 had been inspected by members of Aerosmith's flight crew for possible use earlier that year, but it was rejected because it was felt that neither the plane nor the crew were up to standards. Aerosmith's chief of flight operations, whose name was, get this, Zunk Bucher, tells of seeing pilots McCreary and Gray passing a bottle of Jack Daniels back and forth.
Wow.
As one does.
As one does, yes.
But if you'll recall, it was not a mechanical failure that brought the plane down. They simply didn't put enough fuel in it.
Could have been pilot error, Adam.
Drunk pilots not filling the gas tank.
Yeah, that is a crazy coincidence, though, and I'm a little surprised we didn't mention it. Maybe you knew it and you skipped over it, Adam, but thought that was cool enough to mention on the show. Thank you for alerting us to that, Philip. And we have one more here. It's listener Justin who writes, hey guys, I'd like to start by thanking y'all for keeping me entertained for at least an hour every week. I really look forward to hearing everyone's take on albums I already know, even when I suspect I'll disagree entirely. And you've shed new light on ones I may have ignored or previously written off. For instance, Jesus Christ Superstar. What the fuck? I know. Believe me, I know. As a fellow musician, it's refreshing to hear records analyzed from that perspective, but without the pretentiousness that often comes along with that. Now, I noticed recently, especially in the Ween episode, that you keep bringing up Adam's love for a band called Hoobastank.
Yes. Wow, this is getting traction. I love it.
Seemingly as a goof on how vanilla his taste is, but did you know that much like Ween, Hoobastank was also a weird, goofy, and often super childish band, melding funk, ska, punk, and whatever else in their earlier years? I was in middle school at the time, and I used to see them play regularly, sometimes even helping to sell tickets for them. At that time, they were called, get this, Hoobastank.
What?
With the U. I guess the A made it more commercially viable. That's from about 95 to 98.
So is there a chance that I can fulfill my dream through this listener, that I could meet the guys in Hoobastank or get them on a call? Yes.
He says, anyway, below you'll find a rip I made of their 1997 Muffins demo tape for an excited fan who hit me up on Discogs. So apparently this is an unattainable Hoobastank demo tape called Muffins, which he gave to me as a homework assignment, which I now will happily pass the link to Adam, obviously.
Yes.
I did listen to it. This is Rob again. And it's somewhere between 311 and Primus with an unhealthy portion of Real Big Fish thrown in.
That could either be awesome or most likely objectively terrible.
I'm going to leave it to Adam to listen, digest, and comment at a later date. But Justin rounds out his email by saying, and he's making fun of us even in his sign off. That's going to round out my email. So from all of us listeners, thank you. I've been Justin.
Oh, love it. Well, according to their Wikipedia, they have sold 10 million albums worldwide. So, yeah, I think they're doing all right. Boosh a stank.
Boosh.
And if you want to write us about lost demo tapes and planes that could have killed other prominent bands and saved us listening to Amazing, we'd love to hear from you about that or anything else. Send it on over to 1001albumcomplaints@gmail.com.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. Well, all that's left is to look ahead to the next week and tell us what we are going to listen to. So I'm actually going to kick it right back to you, Rob, to fire up the old Albinator.
Ah, yes. The Albinator has been shipped over courtesy of Tom. It's in the corner smoking a cigarette, strumming on a hurdy-gurdy. It is ready to spit out next week's album. Without further ado, drumroll please. We shall be listening to The Who, and the album is called Who's Next.
Is that the first Who that we've done?
It is.
I'm surprised we got this far. I'm a little scared to do that one with our growing UK contingent that's listening. That one could be tricky.
I think it's going to be scorched earth and sunshine all the way.
Very well, very well. Well, I suspect I've heard all those songs before, but it'll be nice to put them all together, not in a car listening to classic rock radio on the way to the grocery store, but different environment for sure. All right. Well, with that, I have been Alan.
I'm Adam.
I'm Jen.
And I'm Rob.
Boosh.